The old cantina on Nexus Prime was dark and smoky. Strange creatures from across the galaxy sat at metal tables, drinking and talking in low voices. In the far corner, Commander Vextal Corvani sat alone. His forearms rested on the scratched table surface. Deep scars covered his purple skin like a map of old battles. The Zephyrian was 8 feet tall, even sitting down. His body was covered in natural armor plates that clicked softly when he moved. 2 large eyes, black as space, stared into his drink. He had been sitting there for hours, lost in memories. A young Zephyrian approached his table. She was small, for her kind, only 7 feet tall, and her armor plates still showed the bright colors of youth. She carried a recording device in one of her hands. "Commander Corvani?" she asked softly. "My name is Zara. I work for the Galactic News Network. I heard you fought in the war against the humans. Would you tell me about it?" Corvani looked up, slowly. His black eyes studied the young reporter for a long moment. "Why do you want to know about that war, child?" "The peace treaty was signed 40 years ago," Zara said. "But no one talks about what really happened. How did humans go from a primitive species to our equals in just a few years?" The old warrior was quiet for several minutes. Finally, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, but know this. What I tell you may change how you see everything." Zara sat quickly and turned on her recording device. Corvani stared at the small machine, then began to speak. 43 years ago, our scouts found a small blue planet in a system they called Sol. The third planet was covered in water and had 1 moon. Our sensors showed millions of life forms, but only one had developed what could barely be called civilization. Corvani took a long drink from his glass. The liquid inside glowed faintly green. We called them humans. Soft pink creatures with no natural armor, no claws, no poison glands. They were weak and slow compared to us. Their technology was so primitive. They had only just learned to leave their home planet. They had sent a few small ships to nearby worlds, but nothing impressive. The commander's voice grew distant as he remembered. The High Command classified them as Class D primitive life forms. Do you know what that means, child? Zara shook her head. It means they were barely worth our attention. Class D species are usually wiped out or enslaved without much effort. Admiral Thexvar assigned only 1 battle fleet to deal with them. He called it cleaning up a small pest problem. Corvani stood up and walked to the cantina's large window. Outside, ships from dozens of different species flew past the trading station. Many of them had human crews. Our first target was a mining colony on a planet the humans called Kepler 442b. It was far from their home world, with only a few thousand humans living there. They were digging valuable metals from the ground using simple machines. Our intelligence said they had no real weapons, just a few security guards with basic energy rifles. The old Zephyrian turned back to face Zara. We expected to land, round up the humans, and ship them off to the slave markets. It should have taken a few hours at most. Zara leaned forward. What happened? We sent down 3 assault transports, with 200 soldiers. The humans had built their colony in a valley surrounded by rocky hills. Perfect for mining, but terrible for defense. Any military commander would see it was impossible to defend. Corvani sat back down heavily. The transport ships landed outside the colony. Our soldiers marched toward the buildings in perfect formation. That was when we learned our first lesson about humans. He paused, staring into his drink again. The lesson was this: humans do not think like us. When we see an impossible situation, we either run or surrender. Humans see an impossible situation and ask themselves, how can we make this work anyway? The commander continued his story. The head of security was a man named Jake Morrison. He was maybe 6 feet tall, thin with brown hair and blue eyes. Nothing special to look at. Our intelligence files said he used to be a soldier on Earth, but that was years ago. Corvani's 4 hands moved as he talked, describing the scene. Morrison had done something no Zephyrian commander would think of. He took the miners, people who had never fought in their lives, and turned them into soldiers. But not regular soldiers. Something much more dangerous. What do you mean? Zara asked. He taught them to think like humans, to see their weakness as strength. The old warrior stood up again and began pacing. The miners knew every tunnel, every cave, every rock in those hills. Morrison had them dig connecting tunnels between the natural caves. When our soldiers marched toward the colony, they vanished. Corvani's voice grew quieter. 200 of our best shock troops, armed with plasma rifles and energy shields, were suddenly fighting an enemy they could not see. The humans would appear from hidden tunnels, attack, then disappear again. They used their mining explosives as weapons. They turned their digging machines into tanks. He sat down again, his large frame seeming to shrink. But the worst part was not the fighting. The worst part was that they were enjoying it. Zara looked confused. Enjoying it? I was monitoring the human communications from our command ship. I could hear Morrison talking to his people. He was laughing. In the middle of a battle against superior forces, with death all around him, he was laughing and making jokes. Corvani took another drink. Our soldiers were trained to fight other soldiers. They were not trained to fight ghosts who appeared from the ground. After 6 hours, we had lost half our forces and had not captured a single human. The commander's voice became very quiet. That was when Morrison did something that still gives me nightmares. Zara waited, her recording device capturing every word. A piece of metal from one of our destroyed transports had cut Morrison's leg badly. He was bleeding and could barely walk. Our remaining soldiers had surrounded the main mining building where he and 20 other humans were trapped. Corvani looked directly at Zara. Any reasonable commander would surrender at that point. His people were outnumbered, wounded, and trapped. There was no hope. The old warrior was quiet for a long moment. Morrison dragged himself across 50 yards of open ground while our soldiers shot at him. Energy bolts were hitting the rocks around him, but he kept crawling. We thought he was trying to escape. He was not trying to escape. He was crawling toward the main mining charges, enough explosives to level the entire building complex. He reached the detonator just as our soldiers entered the building where his people were hiding. Corvani's voice became almost a whisper. He looked up at our command ship in the sky. He smiled and waved at us, then he pushed the button. The cantina was very quiet. Even the other customers seemed to be listening. The explosion destroyed the mining complex, killed Morrison and his 20 people, and took out our remaining assault transport with 80 soldiers inside. In one moment, this human had turned certain defeat into something that looked almost like victory. Corvani finished his drink. But before he died, Morrison sent a message to the other human colonies. Just 3 words. Make them pay. The old commander looked at Zara with something that might have been respect in his black eyes. We thought courage was knowing you could win. Humans taught us that courage was fighting when you knew you would lose. They taught us that some things are more important than staying alive. Zara realized she had been holding her breath. What happened next? Corvani smiled, but it was not a happy smile. Next, child, we learned that humans have friends, and that humans never ever fight fair. The old warrior gestured to the bartender for another drink. But that is a story for another part of this long tale. Corvani waited for his new drink to arrive. The green liquid glowed softly in the dim cantina light. Zara sat quietly, her recording device still running. Other customers in the bar had moved closer to their table, pretending to mind their own business while listening to the old warrior's story. After the disaster at the mining colony, Corvani continued, the High Command was angry. Admiral Thexvar had promised them an easy victory, but instead we had lost 300 soldiers to a bunch of miners with homemade bombs. The old Zephyrian took a sip of his drink. The admiral blamed bad intelligence. He said our scouts had missed hidden military bases. He convinced the High Command to send 3 full battle fleets to human space. 15,000 soldiers, 50 warships, enough firepower to destroy entire planets. Corvani's forearms moved as he spoke, painting the scene in the air. I was promoted to tactical officer aboard the flagship Crimson Victory. We were sure this time would be different. How could primitive humans stand against the might of 3 battle fleets? He paused, staring into his drink. We learned the answer to that question very quickly. Zara leaned forward. What did the humans do? They had spent 6 months since the mining colony preparing, but not in the way we expected. We thought they would build bigger guns, stronger shields, more ships. Instead, they did something that no species in our records had ever done before. Corvani stood up and walked to the window again. A human cargo ship was docking at the station. Its hull showed clear signs of alien technology mixed with human design. They learned from us, not just our technology, but how we think, how we fight, what makes us afraid. The commander turned back to Zara. When our fleets arrived in the Sol system, we found something impossible waiting for us. Human ships with Zephyrian shields, human weapons that fired our own plasma bolts, human fighters that moved faster than anything we had ever built. Corvani sat down heavily. At first we thought they had captured some of our ships from the mining colony battle, but there had only been 3 small transports there. Nothing, with advanced technology. Then our science officers figured out the truth. He took another drink. The humans had taken pieces of wreckage from those 3 transports and somehow learned to copy our technology. In 6 months, they had gone from primitive energy weapons to plasma cannons that were better than our own. Zara looked confused. How is that possible? We asked ourselves the same question. Our own scientists need years to develop new technology. They follow careful procedures, run thousands of tests, get approval from dozens of committees. Human scientists apparently do things differently. Corvani smiled, but it was not a happy expression. They had a woman named Lisa Rodriguez in charge of their shipbuilding program. She was a captain in something called the Earth Defense Force. Our intelligence files said she had been an engineer before the war started. The old warrior's voice grew thoughtful. Rodriguez did not try to copy our technology exactly. She looked at how it worked, then asked herself, how can we make this better? She mixed our plasma technology with human energy systems. The result was weapons that were more powerful and used less energy than the original Zephyrian design. Corvani stood up and began pacing again. But that was just the beginning. The real shock came when we engaged their fleet near the gas giant they called Jupiter. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Zara. The human commander was a man named Ben Carter. Big man, gray hair, probably 50 years old. He had been in charge of asteroid mining operations before the war. Mining operations, child. Not military. The old Zephyrian sat down again. Carter used the asteroid belt like a weapon. His ships would hide behind the floating rocks, then appear suddenly to attack our formations. But that was normal tactics. What was not normal was what he did next. Corvani's forehands moved to show the battle formation. Carter's ships began throwing asteroids at us. Not small rocks, but mountains of stone and metal weighing millions of tons. They used their mining equipment to capture the asteroids, then accelerated them toward our fleet using gravitational slings. Zara looked amazed. Did that work? Work? Corvani laughed, but there was no joy in the sound. Child, imagine trying to fight an enemy who can throw planets at you. Our best shields could not stop objects that large moving that fast. Carter destroyed 6 of our heavy cruisers with rocks. The commander took another drink. But even that was not the worst part. The worst part was that the humans were talking to each other during the battle, and we could hear them. He looked around the cantina. Several humans were sitting at nearby tables, drinking and laughing with alien friends. They were making jokes. In the middle of a space battle, with death all around them, they were telling stories and laughing at their own humor. Corvani's voice became quieter. I heard one of their pilots, a woman, talking to her wingman while dodging our plasma fire. She said, "Hey, Danny, remember when we thought mining was dangerous?" Then she laughed and destroyed one of our fighters. The old warrior was quiet for a moment. That was when I began to understand something important about humans. They do not fight because they are not afraid. They fight because they choose to be brave even when they are afraid. Zara waited for him to continue. The battle lasted 12 hours. When it was over, we had lost 20 ships and 4,000 soldiers. The humans had lost 6 ships and maybe 300 people. But the real defeat was not in the numbers. Corvani looked directly at the young reporter. The real defeat was in our heads. For the first time in Zephyrian history, we had fought an enemy that was getting stronger during the battle instead of weaker. He stood up and walked to the bar. The human bartender, a cheerful man with red hair, smiled and refilled Corvani's glass. The old warrior nodded his thanks and returned to the table. After the asteroid belt battle, High Command ordered a full analysis of human capabilities. What they found was disturbing. Corvani sat down and continued. The humans had not just copied our technology, they had improved it, then shared those improvements with all their colonies. Every human ship now had better shields than ours. Every human weapon was more efficient. Every human pilot had trained using simulations of Zephyrian tactics. The old commander's voice grew darker, but the most disturbing discovery was about their information warfare capabilities. Zara looked puzzled. Information warfare? A young human named Alex Chen had somehow broken into our military communication networks, not through superior technology but by understanding how Zephyrian society works, Corvani explained. Chen studied our social structure, our chain of command, our cultural customs. Then he sent false orders that looked completely legitimate to Zephyrian officers, orders that sent our ships to the wrong locations, or told our supply convoys to deliver materials to empty space. The old warrior shook his head. Chen was maybe 25 years old. He had never left his home planet before the war started, but somehow he understood our military hierarchy better than some of our own generals. Corvani took a long drink. The worst part was when we realized that Chen had been listening to our private communications for months. He knew our battle plans before some of our own officers did. He looked around the cantina again. That was when we learned the most frightening thing about humans. They study their enemies, not just their technology or their tactics, but their minds. They learn to think like their opponents, then use that knowledge as a weapon. Zara was quiet for several minutes, processing what she had heard, and finally she asked, "What happened next?" Corvani finished his drink and signaled for another. "Next, child, we learned what happens when you corner a species that refuses to surrender. We learned why peaceful creatures can become the most dangerous, enemies of all." The old warrior looked toward the window, where more ships were arriving at the station. Many of them carried mixed crews of humans and aliens working together. But first, let me tell you about the siege that changed everything. The siege that showed us what humans become when they have nothing left to lose. The cantina had grown quieter, as more customers stopped their own conversations to listen to Corvani's story. The old Zephyrian warrior noticed but did not seem to mind. He took a long drink from his glass and stared at the table for several minutes before continuing. "After our defeats in the asteroid belt, the High Command grew desperate," Corvani said. "Admiral Thexvar convinced them that humans were winning because they had safe places to hide their families. He said we needed to attack their civilian colonies to break their will to fight." Zara shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Did you attack civilians?" Corvani nodded slowly. "It was a decision that haunts me to this day. We thought humans would be like other species we had conquered, threaten their children and elderly, and they would surrender to protect them." The old warrior's four hands clenched into fists. "We could not have been more wrong." He stood up and walked to the window again. Outside, a human family was walking past the station's viewing area. Two parents with three small children, all wearing the bright clothing of tourists. Our target was New Geneva, a colony world with 2 million humans. It was not a military base, just a farming planet with cities full of families. The plan was simple: surround the planet, demand surrender, and wait for them to give up. Corvani turned back to face Zara. The colony's governor was a woman named Patricia Wells. She had gray hair and kind eyes, the sort of person you would trust to watch your children. Our intelligence said she had been a teacher on Earth before becoming a colonial administrator. The old commander sat down again. "When our fleet surrounded New Geneva, I personally transmitted the surrender demand to Governor Wells. I expected tears, begging, maybe an offer to negotiate." Corvani's voice grew quiet. Instead, Wells appeared on the communication screen wearing a military uniform I had never seen before. She looked directly into the camera and said, "We have families here. We will protect them. You will not pass." He took another drink. That was the moment I realized we were not fighting the same species that had been mining asteroids 6 months earlier. Something had changed in the humans. Zara leaned forward. What had changed? They had learned to hate us, not the blind. Anger that makes species fight poorly, but the cold, calculating hatred that makes them fight smarter. Corvani began to pace again. Governor Wells had spent 3 months preparing for this moment. Every adult on the planet had received military training. Every building had been turned into a fortress. Every street had hidden weapon positions. The old warrior stopped pacing and looked directly at Zara. But the most shocking thing was what they had done with the children. Zara looked worried. The children? The human children were not hiding in bunkers waiting for rescue. They were part of the defense plan, not as soldiers but as something more dangerous, as motivation. Corvani sat down heavily. Wells had organized the children into groups led by teachers and parents. Their job was to keep the communication networks running, to carry supplies to fighters, and to remember everything that happened. The old commander's voice became very quiet. She told me later, after the war ended, that the children's most important job was to make sure that if New Geneva fell, the rest of humanity would know exactly what we had done. Corvani took a long drink. The siege began at dawn on the first day of spring. We expected to be orbiting a surrendered planet by sunset. He looked around the cantina. Instead, we found ourselves fighting an entire world that had become one giant weapon. The old warrior began describing the battle. Our first landing force consisted of 5,000 soldiers in heavy armor with air support. They landed near the capital city expecting to face maybe a few hundred security guards. Corvani's 4 hands moved as he painted the scene. Instead, they found empty streets lined with buildings that had been turned into fortresses. Every window was a firing position. Every doorway was a trap. Every intersection had hidden explosives. He paused. But the worst part was not the military resistance. The worst part was that the humans had turned their entire civilian population into an intelligence network. Zara looked confused. What do you mean? Children as young as 8 years old were reporting our troop movements to the military command. Elderly humans were guiding sniper teams to the best firing positions. Shop owners were providing detailed maps of underground tunnels. Corvani's voice grew darker. We were not fighting an army. We were fighting a civilization that had decided to resist us with every man, woman, and child. The old commander stood up and walked to the bar again. This time, a human woman sitting nearby smiled and nodded to him. Corvani nodded back respectfully, before returning to his table. The siege lasted 3 months. 3 months of fighting an enemy that seemed to get stronger every day instead of weaker. He sat down and continued. I met many humans during that siege, but one still haunts my dreams. His name was Stephen Hayes. He had been a doctor before the war, taking care of sick children. Corvani's voice became very quiet. Dr. Hayes had organized the medical staff into something he called the Healing Corps. They still treated wounded humans, but they had also learned to treat wounded Zephyrians. Zara looked surprised. They helped your soldiers? Yes, but not the way you might think. Hayes and his people studied captured Zephyrian soldiers to learn about our biology. They discovered weaknesses in our immune systems, pressure points in our armor, ways to make us sick without killing us quickly. The old warrior took another drink. Hayes turned medical knowledge into military intelligence. His people developed biological weapons that made our soldiers too sick to fight, but did not affect humans at all. Corvani looked directly at Zara. Do you understand what that means? This man had spent his life healing people. The war made him into someone who could make weapons from medicine. And he was good at it. The old commander was quiet for a long moment. But Hayes was not the worst thing I encountered on New Geneva. Zara waited for him to continue. The worst thing was a school teacher named Maria Santos. She was maybe 30 years old, with dark hair and a smile that could light up a room. She taught children how to read and write. Corvani's voice became barely a whisper. When our forces finally broke through to the main school complex, we found Santos and 47 children barricaded inside the main building. The old warrior looked around the cantina. Several humans were listening openly now, their faces serious. Our soldiers surrounded the building and demanded surrender. We could see the children through the windows, some as young as 5 years old. We thought surely Santos would give up to protect them. Corvani took a shaky drink. Instead, Santos appeared at the main window holding a communication device. She was broadcasting on all frequencies so every human on the planet could hear. The old commander's voice broke slightly. She said, "Children, remember what I taught you about being brave. Remember that some things are more important than being afraid. Remember that your children and their children will inherit the stars, not chains." Corvani was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. Then Santos smiled at our soldiers, waved goodbye to the children, and triggered the explosives that destroyed the entire school complex. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background music had stopped. 47 children died in that explosion, along with Santos and 12 of our soldiers who had just entered the building. But her final broadcast became a rallying cry that spread across all of human space. Corvani finished his drink. We won New Geneva after 3 months of fighting, but the cost was so terrible that victory felt like defeat. We had lost 8,000 soldiers to take one planet. Worse, every human colony now knew exactly what we were capable of, and they were preparing accordingly. The old warrior looked at Zara with eyes that held decades of regret. That was when we learned the most dangerous truth about humans. They do not fight just to win. They fight to make sure their children have a better future, and they will sacrifice anything, including their own lives, to protect that future. Corvani signaled for another drink, but even that lesson was not enough to prepare us for what came next. We still had to learn what happens when you make humans truly angry. Corvani sat quietly for several minutes after finishing his drink. The cantina around them had become almost silent. Even the alien bartender was listening while pretending to clean glasses. The old Zephyrian warrior seemed to be gathering strength for the next part of his story. After New Geneva, Corvani finally said, everything changed. The humans stopped being the species we were trying to conquer. They became something else entirely. He gestured to the bartender for another drink. The High Command was confused and angry. We had won the siege, but somehow it felt like we had lost. Every human colony was now preparing for total war. Worse, other species in our empire were starting to ask questions. Zara shifted in her chair. What kind of questions? Questions like, if humans can fight Zephyrians for 3 months on one planet, maybe we can fight them too. Questions that made the High Command very nervous. Corvani received his new drink and took a careful sip. Admiral Thexvar decided we needed one decisive victory to break human morale completely. He chose to attack Proxima Station, the main human military base outside their home system. The old warrior's 4 hands moved to show the battle formation. Thexvar assembled the largest fleet in Zephyrian history, 200 ships, including 5 dreadnoughts and our newest superweapon, 50,000 soldiers, the best equipment we had ever built. Corvani looked directly at Zara. I was tactical officer aboard the flagship Eternal Dominion. It was the largest ship ever constructed, by our people, armed with planet-killing weapons and shields that could stop any known attack. He paused. We thought we were bringing enough force to end the war in a single battle. The old commander stood up and walked to the window. A massive human cargo ship was docking at the station, its hull showing scars from countless journeys between star systems. The human fleet that met us at Proxima Station was half our size. 100 ships, most of them smaller than our cruisers. Their commander was a man named Tony Martinez. Corvani turned back to face Zara. Admiral Martinez was not what we expected. He was maybe 40 years old, with gray at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes. Our intelligence said he had been a history teacher on Earth before joining their military. The old warrior sat down again. A history teacher, child. Not a career soldier, not a tactical genius, just a man who taught children about old wars, fought centuries ago on their home planet. Corvani took another drink. When Martinez appeared on our communication screen to receive our surrender demand, he was smiling. Not the frightened smile of someone trying to be brave, but the confident smile of someone who knew something we did not. The old commander's voice grew thoughtful. Martinez told Admiral Thexavar that he had studied every military defeat in human history. He said he had learned from generals named Alexander, Napoleon, and Patton, names that meant nothing to us. Then, Corvani began to pace around the table. The Admiral demanded immediate surrender. Martinez replied by transmitting something that still gives me nightmares. Zara leaned forward. What did he transmit? A complete tactical analysis of every Zephyrian battle fought in the past 50 years. Martinez had studied our military history better than our own generals. He knew our standard formations, our preferred strategies, our weaknesses. The old warrior stopped pacing and looked directly at Zara. But that was not the frightening part. The frightening part was that Martinez had found patterns in our fighting that we had never noticed ourselves. Corvani sat down heavily. Martinez explained to Admiral Thexavar exactly how he was going to defeat our fleet. He described our probable attack formations, predicted our tactical responses, and outlined his counter-strategies. Then he thanked us for being so predictable. The old commander's voice grew darker. Admiral Thexavar was furious. He ordered an immediate attack, using exactly the formation Martinez had predicted we would use. Corvani gestured with his 4 hands, recreating the battle in the air above the table. Our dreadnoughts moved into standard heavy assault formation. Our cruisers took flanking positions. Our fighters prepared for a coordinated strike. He paused. Everything happened exactly as Martinez had said it would, the old warrior continued. But the human response was like nothing in our military databases. Instead of meeting our formation with their own formation, the human ships scattered in all directions. Corvani's voice grew excited despite himself. It looked like panic at first. Our tactical computers calculated that we had already won. But then the human ships began to move in patterns that seemed random, but somehow worked perfectly together. He stood up again and began pacing. Martinez had divided his fleet into small groups, each one commanded by officers who could make their own decisions without waiting for orders. When our dreadnoughts fired their main guns, the human ships were no longer where our computers said they should be. Corvani looked around the cantina. Several humans were now openly listening to his story, their faces showing interest and pride. The battle should have lasted 30 minutes. Our computer simulations all showed the same result: total human defeat with minimal Zephyrian losses. The old commander sat down again. Instead, the battle lasted 18 hours and became a masterclass in tactics that our military academies still study today. Corvani took a long drink. The turning point came when a human pilot named Jenny Walsh did something that our scientists said was impossible. Zara waited for him to continue. Walsh was flying a small fighter craft, being chased by 3 of our heavy interceptors. She was outnumbered and outgunned with no chance of escape. Corvani's voice grew quiet with something that might have been respect. Instead of running or surrendering, Walsh flew directly toward our flagship at maximum speed. Our gunners were shooting at her, but she was somehow dodging plasma bolts while flying in a straight line. The old warrior shook his head. Then Walsh did something that violated every principle of safe spaceflight. She used the gravity field of our own dreadnought to slingshot her fighter around our ship at velocities that should have crushed her into paste. Corvani looked directly at Zara. The gravitational forces she experienced should have killed any living being. Our medical computers calculated that her body was experiencing pressure equivalent to being crushed by a mountain. He paused. But through the communication channels, we could hear Walsh laughing. She was pulling forces that would kill most species, and she was laughing with pure joy. The old commander's voice became almost a whisper. Walsh used our own ship's gravity to accelerate her fighter to attack speed, then destroyed 2 of our escort cruisers before escaping. She turned our largest vessel into a weapon against our own fleet. Corvani took another drink. But even that was not the worst thing that happened at Proxima Station. Zara leaned forward. What was worse? Commander Rick Murphy and his fighter squadron performed a maneuver that our tactical computers still cannot fully explain. The old warrior stood up and walked to the window again. Murphy was leading 12 human fighters against 40 of our interceptors. He was badly outnumbered, with no hope of victory using conventional tactics. Corvani turned back to face Zara. So Murphy used unconventional tactics. He led his squadron on what looked like a retreat toward the nearby planet. Our fighters followed, expecting an easy victory. The old commander's four hands moved to show the maneuver. But Murphy was not retreating. He was using the planet's gravity to accelerate his ships to impossible speeds. His squadron flew around the planet's gravity well like bullets in a slingshot. Corvani's voice grew excited despite himself. When Murphy's fighters emerged from behind the planet, they were moving faster than anything we had ever recorded. They flew straight through our interceptor formation and destroyed 36 ships in less than 5 minutes. The old warrior sat down again. The forces Murphy's pilots experienced should have killed them instantly. But somehow they not only survived, they fought better than ever. Corvani looked around the cantina. That was when I realized something that changed how I see the universe. Humans do not just fight harder when the odds are against them. They think differently. They see possibilities that other species cannot imagine. The old commander finished his drink. The Battle of Proxima Station ended with the destruction of our flagship and half our fleet. Admiral Thexvar died when the Eternal Dominion exploded. For the first time in Zephyrian history, our forces retreated from a battle we should have won easily. Corvani looked directly at Zara with eyes that held decades of memory. That night, as I sat in a medical bay getting treatment for my injuries, I realized something that terrified me more than any weapon. Zara waited. I realized that we were not fighting another military force. We were fighting evolution itself, compressed into just a few years of war. Every battle made humans stronger, smarter, more dangerous. The old warrior gestured to the bartender for another drink. But even that lesson was not enough to prepare us for humanity's final gambit, the move that ended the war and changed the galaxy forever. Corvani stared at his drink for a long time before continuing his story. The cantina had become completely quiet. Every customer, human and alien alike, was listening to the old warrior's tale. Even the bartender had stopped pretending to work and was openly watching the table where the Zephyrian veteran sat with the young reporter. After Proxima Station, Corvani finally said, the Zephyrian Empire began to crack like a broken shell. He took a small sip of his drink. The defeat was so complete, so impossible by our understanding of warfare, that many of our military leaders simply refused to believe it had happened. They claimed the reports were lies, that human spies had somehow faked the battle recordings. The old commander looked around the cantina, but the other species in our empire knew the truth. If humans could destroy our greatest fleet, maybe those species could fight us too. Zara leaned forward. Did they rebel? 3 star systems declared independence the week after Proxima Station. The Altarian Federation, the Vegan Trade Union, and the Centauri Mining Collective all announced they were leaving the Empire. Corvani's 4 hands moved as he spoke. The High Command was facing a choice. They could continue fighting humans while dealing with rebellions across the Empire, or they could find a way to end the war quickly. The old warrior stood up and walked to the window. Outside, ships from dozens of different species were moving peacefully through space, many with mixed crews working together. But humans made that choice for us. He turned back to face Zara. 3 weeks after Proxima Station, a single human ship appeared in orbit around our home world. One small vessel against the most heavily defended planet in the galaxy. Corvani sat down again. The ship was called Peacemaker, and it was commanded by Captain Carol Fisher. She was maybe 35 years old with short blonde hair and green eyes that seemed to see everything. The old commander's voice grew thoughtful. Captain Fisher did not attack our defenses. She did not threaten our cities. Instead, she did something that no enemy had ever done in Zephyrian history. Zara waited for him to continue. She asked permission to speak directly to our civilian population. Corvani took another drink. The High Command was confused. No alien species had ever wanted to talk to ordinary Zephyrians. Enemy leaders talked to our leaders. That was how things worked. The old warrior's voice grew softer. But Fisher insisted. She said she had a message for every Zephyrian citizen, not just the military command. She promised that if we allowed her to broadcast, she would leave peacefully afterward. Corvani looked directly at Zara. The High Command agreed, thinking they could control whatever propaganda Fisher wanted to spread. They were wrong. He stood up and began pacing again. Fisher's broadcast lasted 30 minutes. She spoke in perfect High Zephyrian, the formal language used for official ceremonies. Her pronunciation was so perfect that many people thought she was using a translation program. The old commander stopped pacing. But Fisher was not using any program. She had learned our language completely, including cultural meanings and historical references that even some Zephyrians do not understand. Corvani sat down again. Fisher began her speech by listing every battle of the war, every ship destroyed, every soldier killed on both sides. She spoke the names of Zephyrian war dead with the same respect she gave to human casualties. The old warrior's voice became very quiet. Then Fisher did something that changed everything. She apologized. Zara looked surprised. Apologized? Fisher apologized to the Zephyrian people for the war. She said humans were sorry that our leaders had forced us into conflict. She said both species had lost too much already. Corvani took a long drink, but then Fisher explained something that our own leaders had never told us. She explained why humans had fought so hard, why they refused to surrender. The old commander looked around the cantina. Fisher said that humans believed all intelligent species should be free to choose their own path among the stars. She said the war happened because Zephyrians had been taught to conquer, while humans had been taught to explore. Corvani's voice grew stronger. Then Fisher made an offer that no Zephyrian leader could have imagined. Zara leaned forward. What kind of offer? She offered to teach us. Not human technology or human tactics, but human philosophy. The idea that different species could work together instead of one ruling over others. The old warrior stood up and walked to the bar. The human bartender smiled and refilled his glass without being asked. Corvani nodded his thanks and returned to the table. Fisher's broadcast included detailed plans for trade agreements, joint exploration missions, and shared defense treaties. She showed how Zephyrian engineering combined with human innovation could build things neither species could create alone. Corvani sat down heavily, but the most important part of Fisher's message was hidden in the technical details she provided. The old commander's voice became almost a whisper. Embedded in her trade proposals and defense plans was clear proof that humans had not just caught up to Zephyrian technology. They had surpassed it. Zara looked confused. How? Fisher casually mentioned new types of faster-than-light travel that would make our best ships look like toys. She described energy sources that could power entire star systems. She outlined weapons that could destroy planets from the other side of the galaxy. Corvani took a shaky drink, but she presented all of this as gifts she wanted to share, not threats she was making. The old warrior looked directly at Zara. Fisher's message made it clear that humans could have destroyed our homeworld at any time during the war. Instead, they had chosen to fight only military targets to spare civilian lives, to show mercy to an enemy that had shown them none. Corvani was quiet for several minutes. When he spoke again, his voice held something that might have been shame. 3 days after Fisher's broadcast, riots broke out across the Zephyrian homeworld, not riots of anger, but riots of citizens demanding that their government end the war immediately. The old commander gestured with his 4 hands. For the first time in our history, ordinary Zephyrians were questioning why we needed to conquer other species. They were asking why we could not be explorers and traders instead of warriors and slavers. Corvani stood up and walked to the window again. The High Command realized they had lost more than the war. They had lost the support of their own people. He turned back to face Zara. 2 weeks later, the Zephyrian Empire formally surrendered, but it was not really a surrender. It was the beginning of something completely new. The old warrior sat down for the final time. The peace treaty was negotiated by Ambassador Helen Roberts, a human diplomat who understood Zephyrian culture better than many of our own politicians. Corvani's voice grew warm. Ambassador Roberts did not treat us like defeated enemies. She treated us like future partners. The peace treaty included provisions for Zephyrian officers to serve in a new combined fleet, for joint research projects, for cultural exchange programs. The old commander looked around the cantina at the mixed groups of humans and aliens talking and laughing together. Roberts offered us something we had never experienced before, equality with the species we had tried to conquer. Corvani finished his drink and looked directly at Zara. You asked me what I learned fighting humans. I learned that there are 3 types of species in the galaxy. Species you can conquer, species you can destroy, and species you hope will let you join them. The old warrior's voice grew strong and clear. Humanity is the 3rd type. They do not fight because they enjoy war. They fight because they refuse to let anyone take away freedom, their own freedom or anyone else's. Corvani stood up slowly. 40 years ago, I was a warrior in the greatest military force the galaxy had ever seen. Today, I serve as a cultural advisor helping other species learn to work with humans in the Galactic Defense Fleet. He looked toward the window where ships from dozens of worlds moved peacefully through space. The galaxy is safer now because humans taught us that strength is not about what you can destroy. Strength is about what you choose to protect. The old Zephyrian turned back to Zara one final time. Humans taught us the most important lesson any species can learn. They taught us that the greatest victory is not defeating your enemies. The greatest victory is turning your enemies into friends. Corvani picked up his empty glass and walked toward the bar. Before leaving, he turned back to the young reporter. Never underestimate a species that can turn its greatest weakness into its greatest strength. Humans die easily, so they learned, to make their lives count for something important. That makes them the most dangerous enemies and the most valuable allies in the galaxy. As the old warrior reached the bar, the human bartender smiled and offered him another drink. Corvani accepted it gratefully and raised his glass toward the mixed crowd of humans and aliens in the cantina. To the humans, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, who taught us that peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is what you build when brave people choose to trust each other. The entire cantina raised their glasses and drank to his toast. And in that moment, Zara understood that she had not just heard a war story. She had heard the story of how the galaxy learned to hope.